For years he watched from behind those cold metal bars, waiting everyday people walked past his cage, their faces lighting up as they picked out puppies. Papers were signed, excited voices filled the air, and tails wagged as dogs left with their new families, but no one ever stopped for him. He had given up hope until one day something changed. A couple stood in front of his kennel looking directly at him. At first he thought they were just like all the others, curious but uninterested, but then something unexpected happened. They pointed at him. The worker nodded. Papers were signed, and that's when he realized he was going home. But what happened next no one saw coming. Hunter had lost track of how long he had been in that shelter. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and months into what felt like an eternity. At first he had been hopeful. Every time someone walked through the adoption area, he would jump to his feet, wag his tail, and press his nose against the metal bars of his cage, hoping, praying that today would be the day. But it never was. He had. Welcome to ZF Story Life. Every story we tell is filled with emotions, lessons, and unforgettable moments. From touching animal tales to powerful life stories, get ready for content that moves your heart. Subscribe now and experience the magic of storytelling. Watch too many dogs come and go, each one leaving with a new family, while he remained behind. The energetic puppies, the small breeds, even some of the older dogs, all of them were chosen before him. He had done everything he could to get noticed. He had tried barking excitedly like the younger dogs, but that didn't work. He had tried sitting quietly and looking up with pleading eyes, hoping for sympathy. That didn't work either. At some point he had simply stopped trying. Now when people walked by, he barely lifted his head. What was the point? The shelter was a loud, chaotic place. Dogs barked constantly. The air smelled of disinfectant, and the concrete floors were always cold. Volunteers came and went, feeding them, cleaning their cages, and occasionally taking them for short walks outside. But Hunter never felt free. His cage was small, just big enough for him to turn around in. His food bowl was always filled, but the kibble was dry and tasteless. The only time he felt warmth was when a staff member stopped by to scratch behind his ears, but those moments were rare. At night, when the barking quieted down and the lights dimmed, he let himself remember he hadn't always lived like this. Once, a long time ago, he had a home, a real home, a warm bed, a backyard to run in, a person who had loved him. But that was another life, one that felt like a distant dream. Now he was just another forgotten shelter dog, waiting for a chance that might never come. Then one afternoon something changed. He didn't realize it at first. He was curled up in his usual spot, resting his head on his paws, when he noticed movement outside his kennel. A man and a woman stood there. He had seen plenty of visitors before. They would stop, glance and into each cage, and then move on, usually drawn to the younger, more energetic dogs. But these two, they didn't move on. They were looking at him. He lifted his head slightly but didn't get up. They spoke in hushed tones to the shelter worker. The worker nodded. A few moments later, the latch on his cage clicked. He hadn't heard that sound in a long time. A leash slipped around his neck. A voice spoke his name, and then, for the first time in what felt like forever, he stepped outside. The air outside the kennel felt different. For so long, the only world Hunter had known was the cramped space behind those metal bars. The scent of disinfectant, the noise of barking dogs, and the cold floor had become his reality. But now, as he took his first steps outside the kennel, something felt unfamiliar, almost overwhelming. The leash around his neck was loose, but the shelter worker held it, gently guiding him toward the front of the building. His paws touched the tile floor, and he hesitated for a moment. Where was he going? He had been out of his cage before but only for short walks. In the small play area behind the shelter, and every time he had been brought right back to his kennel, back to the same small space that had become his prison. This time felt different. He could feel the eyes of the other dogs watching him as he passed their kennels. Some barked, others whined, but most just stared, silent, curious. They had seen other dogs leave before, and they all knew what it meant. Hunter kept walking. The shelter worker led him through a hallway and then toward the glass doors. At the entrance beyond the doors he could see sunlight streaming onto the sidewalk. Cars passed by. A warm breeze blew through the trees outside. It had been so long since he had truly been outside. The couple was waiting for him. Near the front desk the man held a stack of papers in his hands while the woman smiled softly, kneeling slightly as he approached. Hunter stopped, unsure. The worker gave the leash a gentle tug. "It's okay, buddy," the man said, his voice calm, steady. Hunter blinked, studying them. He had seen so many people walk past his cage without a second glance, but these two had stopped, and now they were taking him somewhere. The worker handed the leash over to the man. Hunter stood still, not knowing what to do. The woman reached out, extending her hand for him to sniff. He hesitated before lowering his head slightly, his nose twitching as he took in her scent. She smelled different from the shelter workers, like lavender and something warm, something familiar. The woman's smile widened. "You're coming home with us," she whispered. Home, that word stirred something deep in Hunter's chest. He had almost forgotten what it meant. The man finished signing the paperwork, and the shelter worker stepped back, and just like that, Hunter wasn't a shelter dog anymore. As the couple led him toward the doors, the world outside seemed impossibly large. The sunlight hit his fur, and he squinted slightly at the brightness. The sounds of the city were louder than he remembered. Cars' voices, birds chirping, and then he saw the car. The woman opened the back door, motioning for him to hop in. Hunter hesitated, his body tensed for a moment. An old memory surfaced. The last time he had been in a car, it hadn't ended well. The hesitation must have shown on his face, because the man knelt beside him, his hand gently rubbing his back. "It's okay, buddy," he said, again, softer this time. Hunter looked up at him. There was something in the man's eyes, something patient, something kind. Slowly, carefully, Hunter stepped into the car. The door closed. The woman turned to the man, squeezing his arm. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "He's really ours." The engine started, and as the car pulled away from the shelter, Hunter laid down, his head resting on his paws. He didn't know what was waiting for him, but for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to believe maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The car ride was quiet. Hunter lay in the back seat, his body still, his breathing slow. The hum of the engine, the rhythmic movement of the car, it was all too familiar, yet completely different from what he had known before. He had been in a car once before, but that memory was not a good one. It was the last time he had seen his old home, the last time he had felt a familiar touch. That day the car ride had ended in confusion, fear, and a place he never expected, the shelter. So now, as the tires rolled over the pavement and the city passed by outside, Hunter didn't let himself relax just yet. He didn't know where they were taking him. The woman, Emily, turned in her seat, glancing back at him. "He's so calm," she said softly. "Hek, probably unsure," Daniel replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's a lot of change at once." Hunter flicked his ears, listening. He could sense the emotion in their voices, soft, patient, careful. They weren't rushing him. They weren't forcing him. That was different. As the car slowed, the outside world changed. The tall buildings and noisy streets faded, replaced by quieter roads, trees, and houses with wide yards. Then finally they stopped. The sound of the engine disappeared, leaving only the Soft chirping of birds outside. Hunter lifted his head. The door opened. Fresh air rushed in, warm and filled with unfamiliar scents. Daniel reached into the back seat and gently clipped the leash to Hunter's collar. "All right, big guy," he said. "Let'n go home." Home, there was that word again. Hunter hesitated for just a moment before stepping out of the car. His paws touched soft grass. It wasn't cold concrete. It wasn't the hard, unforgiving floors of the shelter. It was real living earth beneath him. He stood still, his eyes scanning his surroundings. A house stood before him, simple but welcoming. The porch had a wooden bench, and there were flowers planted near the walkway. The air smelled of fresh cut grass and something Hunter couldn't quite place. Something warm, something safe. Emily knelt a few feet away, holding the leash loosely in her hands. "You're okay," she said softly. "Take your time." Hunter looked at her, then at Daniel, who stood beside her. They weren't pulling him, they weren't hurrying him inside, they were letting him decide. And so slowly, cautiously, Hunter took a step forward, then another, and as he walked through the front door he felt something unfamiliar stir deep inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have in a long time. Hope. As Hunter stepped through the front door he paused. The house smelled different from anything he had known in a long time. It wasn't the sharp scent of disinfectant from the shelter, nor the overwhelming mix of dog food and metal cages. Instead, it was warm wood, fresh laundry, something faintly sweet, maybe food. His nails clicked softly against the hardwood floor as he cautiously took another step. Emily and Daniel stood nearby, watching him but not forcing him to move. They were waiting. He wasn't used to that. In the shelter everything was on a schedule. The workers came in, fed the dogs, cleaned the cages, and took them out when they had time. No one waited for a dog to feel ready. Hunter turned his head, slightly scanning the room. The furniture was soft and inviting. A couch, a rug, a dog bed in the corner. A dog bed. He hesitated. It had been so long since he had a place of his own. Emily crouched down near the bed and patted the cushion. "Come here, buddy," she said gently. Hunter looked at her, then at Daniel, who stood beside her with his hands in his pockets. Relaxed but observant, they weren't making him do anything. Still, the idea of lying down in that bed felt wrong. Somehow, like maybe if he got too comfortable it would be taken away. So instead he walked toward the couch, sniffing the fabric. He didn't jump up. He knew better than that. Emily smiled. "You can go up if you want," she said, sitting on the floor beside him. Hunter flicked an ear. She was giving him permission. He wasn't sure what to do with that. At the shelter there were strict rules. The dogs weren't allowed on furniture. They weren't allowed to roam freely. There was no softness, no comfort. Hunter hesitated, then carefully lowered himself to the floor near the couch. That seemed safer. Emily reached out her hand, hovering for a moment before she slowly, gently ran her fingers along his back. He tensed for just a second, then let out a quiet breath. It had been so long since anyone had touched him like that, not out of obligation, not as part of a routine, but just to be kind. Daniel sat down in a chair across the room, watching quietly. "He's figuring it out," he said. Emily nodded. "Yeah, he'll need some time." Hunter closed his eyes for a moment. Time. Would he really be allowed that here, or was this just another temporary stop before he was taken away again? He didn't know yet, but for the first time in years he wasn't behind bars, and that was something. The first few days in his new home were quiet. Hunter moved cautiously through the house, learning its scents, its sounds, its patterns. He didn't roam far, always keeping close to the walls, never venturing too deep into the unfamiliar space. Daniel and Emily gave him space. They didn't crowd him, didn't force affection on him. They spoke softly, moving at a slow, steady pace, as if they understood that trust couldn't be built overnight. He ate his food but only when no one was watching. He drank from his water bowl, but would freeze if footsteps approached. While he did, he found comfort in small corners where he could observe without being noticed. It wasn't that he didn't want to trust them, it was that he didn't know how. At the shelter, trust had meant getting hurt. Dogs were returned all the time. Families took them home only to bring them back when they decided it was too much work. He had seen it happen over and over again. He had learned that hope only led to disappointment. But then one evening something changed. It was late. The house was dimly lit, the soft hum of the television filling the quiet. Emily sat on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, her fingers running absent-mindedly along the fabric. Daniel was reading something, his brow furrowed in concentration. Hunter lay in his usual spot near the couch, not too close, not too far, just near enough to watch. Then, without really thinking, he moved. It was just a small movement, a tiny shift forward, his paws sliding slightly closer to Emily's feet. She noticed she didn't say anything, didn't reach out, but he saw the way her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. A few minutes passed. He inched forward again. This time he let his head rest gently against the side of the couch. Emily exhaled softly, but still. She didn't touch him, she didn't rush him. She waited, and finally Hunter let out a deep breath and closed his eyes. It was the first time in years that he had allowed himself to be close to someone, the first time he had let himself relax, and for the first time he started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. The weeks passed, and slowly Hunter began to change. At first, the differences were small, so small that Daniel and Emily almost didn't notice. He started eating while they were in the room instead of waiting for them to leave. His tail, once always tucked low, began to lift slightly when he walked. Then came the real change. One morning, Daniel clipped Hunter's leash onto his collar and led him outside. It was a warm day, the sky a soft blue with wisps of white clouds scattered across it. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and birds chirped from the trees lining the quiet neighborhood. Emily stood by the porch, watching as Daniel walked Hunter toward the park. Down the street, Hunter moved carefully, still uncertain, still hesitant. But he was trying. That was what mattered. When they reached the park, Daniel led him toward a grassy field away from the small playground where children played. It was peaceful, open, a place where Hunter could breathe. Daniel kneeled beside him and unclipped the leash. For a moment, Hunter just stood there. He looked at Daniel, then at the open field. The last time he had been truly free, he had been abandoned. The last time he had run, he had been running after someone he wasn't sure what to do. Daniel didn't rush him. He simply sat back on the grass watching, waiting. Then something shifted in Hunter's mind. A memory flickered, running through a backyard, feeling the wind in his fur, hearing laughter as he chased a ball. His paws twitched, and before he even realized what he was doing, he ran. His legs stretched, his muscles remembered what it was like to move without restriction. The air rushed past his ears, and his tail lifted higher than it had in years. Emily gasped from the porch, covering her mouth as she watched. Daniel just smiled. Hunter ran in circles, at first unsure, then faster, stronger. He turned back toward Daniel, his tail wagging, his tongue hanging out. For the first time since leaving the shelter, Hunter was happy, and when Daniel called his name, he didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward him, sliding to a stop in front of him, panting hard but alive. Daniel reached out and scratched behind his ears. "Good boy," he murmured. Hunter pressed his head into Daniel's hand, closing his eyes. For the first time in years he believed it. The seasons changed. The days grew colder, the air crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. The house, once unfamiliar, had become something else entirely. It had become home. Hunter no longer hesitated when stepping through The front door he no longer flinched. When Daniel or Emily reached out to pet him, his tail, once stiff and uncertain, now wagged freely. He had learned the routines of the house, the quiet mornings when Emily sipped her coffee by the window, the evenings when Daniel sat by the fireplace with a book. He had learned that when the doorbell rang he didn't need to be afraid, that when Emily kneeled down and opened her arms he could lean into her warmth without fearing rejection. Most of all, he had learned what it meant to belong again. One evening, as the first chill of winter settled in, Hunter lay by the couch, his head resting near Daniel's feet. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, filling the room with a golden glow. Emily curled up with a blanket, glancing down at Hunter with a soft smile. "Can you believe how much he's changed?" she murmured. Daniel nodded, his fingers idly scratching behind Hunter's ear. "He just needed time," he said. Hunter sighed deeply. His body completely relaxed. The old fears were gone. The cold, hard floors of the shelter were just a distant memory. He was no longer the forgotten dog behind metal bars. He was home, and as he drifted off to sleep, the last thought in his mind wasn't one of loss or loneliness. It was of warmth, safety, and love, because for the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for a home, he had one. Hunter's story is a reminder that every dog deserves a second chance. There are thousands of dogs like him waiting behind metal bars, hoping that someone will look past their age, past their scars, and see the love they still have to give. If this story touched your heart, consider supporting your local animal shelter. Adopt, foster, donate, or simply spread awareness. And if you love this journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share Hunter's story with someone who believes in second chances, because sometimes all it takes is one person to change a life forever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more powerful and emotional stories. See you in the next one.